Well, hello everyone. This is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. Welcome to Business Casual, our weekly podcast. We have a special guest today, and I'm really happy about it. It's Conrad Chua, who had been with the Cambridge Judge Business School for many years. In fact, over 16 years. He left in 2025 as executive director of the Cambridge MBA. More than that, though, he knows the European business school market probably better than anyone. For many years, he had been the head of MBA admissions and recruitment at Cambridge Judge. And more recently, he's taken on the job of associate program director for the MS in finance and economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Conrad, welcome.
Thanks so much, John. Great to be here.
And of course, we also have a very familiar voice that you'll hear soon enough, Maria Wickvilla, who is our co-host. Caroline is off. Actually, she's traveling to London, and I believe that at the moment of this recording, she is on a plane and inaccessible. But today we want to talk about, what everyone is going to be talking about this past week. It's the new Financial Times MBA ranking. This is the 28th year the FT has published an MBA ranking. And for the first time ever, MIT Sloan is number one. Almost more interesting to me, frankly, is not that MIT is number one, but the fact that Columbia, Bocconi, and Stanford are not on the list at all, in part because of a low response rate on the alumni survey that the FT puts out. So if you can't meet the response threshold, you're tossed off the ranking, and that's the case for Columbia, Bocconi, and Stanford for the second year in a row, incidentally, which I think really undermines the credibility of a ranking not to have three of the best schools in the world included in this ranking. Conrad has done really some fascinating analyses of the FT rankings in the past, including sort of looking over the salary data in detail and drawing some interesting conclusions from his analysis. And then more recently, on his LinkedIn feed, doing a prediction of what this ranking is going to look like. Oh, now we know what it's going to look like. So, Conrad, what do you make of this? First off, let's just step back from the actual results and talk about the FT ranking in general. How credible is it? How much weight should applicants put on a ranking like the FT? What do you think?
Well, John, I think the issue is that there are not many rankings left anymore.
True.
People like The Economist have stopped. Forbes is once every 2 years if they do, and it's all very skimpy. And the Financial Times, whether you love it or hate it, it's the one that has been around, as you say, 28 years. It has a lot of data, lots of schools go participate, and lots of candidates look at it as well. So it is the big kahuna. And I think people do fixate quite a bit on the FT rankings. Now, when I started, one thing that I appreciated about the FT rankings was it didn't change very much, the methodology, right?
Yes,
And
true.
that probably meant not much to write about for someone like yourself, but I think that meant there was a certain simplicity to it. Yeah. And one thing I do feel in the last couple of years is that we've got all these other criteria being added, changed, chopped from year to year, such that it becomes a bit more difficult to compare the same program, right, over the space of a couple of years when you've got new criteria. And some of the criteria really don't talk about the MBA program itself. It's more on a school-wide basis, right?
Like the
So,
measuring carbon footprint and measuring
yeah.
ESG and things like this.
Yeah, so I think ultimately, candidates, they're interested in the ranking, but they're also really interested in certain categories like salary, salary increase, career progression. And the FT admittedly puts quite a bit of weight to that. Almost 60% of the ranking is for those kind of criteria, but you've got so many of these others that come in that it sort of muddies the picture a bit.
Yeah. Now, one data field that's important, as you just noted, is alumni salary 3 years out. And of course, schools don't track this. So the FT does an estimate based on the responses from alumni. Since alumni know, in fact, that their responses are going to be basically responsible for their alma mater's ranking, do you think that there's some inflation in some of these numbers, or do you think that people answer these surveys honestly?
John, it's difficult to say, right? Because we actually don't really know what the alumni data is. The FT does report the weighted salary, but it's an average of 3 years worth of data. Then they also have a conversion, this purchasing power parity, which does advantage alumni from certain regions, right? And so the final number you get does sometimes just doesn't square with what the alumni actually are earning. So I think that's one. I think the other part, which we could talk more about, is the response rate, right? And that's one thing which, for all the data that the FT publishes, they don't publish the response rate or the number of responses they got from a school. And for listeners, to the threshold is 20% of the class, or at least 20 respondents for those cohorts that are smaller than 100, right? So you can imagine if you can just get in with 25, 23 responses, that could really skew the the salary figures or the alumni figures quite a lot from year to year, depending on who responds. So I'd love it if the FT were to um, publish the response rate for each school, and then we kind of know, well, is it someone like, I'm trying to think, like INSEAD with almost 1,000 students, if they can get 30%, that's 300 responses.
That's a
And
pretty
you
good
probably
sample.
have, yeah, that's a huge sample,
Yeah.
right? Compared to somebody else which is much smaller and they have only 20 respondents.
Yeah, that's very true. It would be very helpful. And, usually in journalism, when a journalistic enterprise does a survey, it's almost considered a necessary, ethically part of a survey to say, here's how many surveys we sent out, here's how many we received back that were completed, and then here's our overall percentage response rate. I mean, that's generally considered an ethical practice in journalistic circles. And certainly, the footnotes to the FT ranking are sizable enough so that it would be a very simple thing to have a table in those footnotes indicating the percentage response rate for each of the schools that are ranked. In part, what that allows is you can look at the data and say, okay, I'm going to discount this a little bit because I don't think the response rate is as solid as I would like. But the user doesn't have the opportunity to make that evaluation because essentially the FT is hiding those response rates per school. Um, Maria is one of our great skeptics about rankings. So am I, to be honest, even though I created the Business Week one back in 1988. But I know, what's in that black box. And sometimes it's kind of ugly. It's like when you're in the kitchen and you're preparing the food, it can be a messy practice. And you bring it out on a nice plate and a white linen tablecloth, and it looks very fancy and it looks really good. And that's what the public sees, but they don't see the mess in the kitchen. Now, Maria, what do you make of the newest FT ranking?
A mess in the kitchen. Indeed. Look, I don't think it, I would, I'm just building off of your comment, John. I don't actually think that this year's ranking is a mess in the kitchen. But I think that Conrad brings up some really excellent points about some of the methodology. Just to sort of build on this idea about like the respondents and the percentage of respondents. And I don't know if so they say that they survey alumni, but I don't know, do they just send it a blanket email to every alumnus or an alumna, or do they selectively choose? Because if I as long as I know I just need to hit a certain threshold, maybe the first batch of emails goes out to all of my alums who are working in private equity and management consulting. And then my second batch goes out to people who are working in like because that salary number plays such an outsized role in this ranking, you know, I might want to fudge it. And even if they're not actually doing that, even if I'm just being cynical or skeptical, everyone's career goes through peaks and valleys. That's just life. And I have to think that if I'm an alumna and I get this survey during a time when maybe I'm unemployed or underemployed, I'm probably not going to be super excited to reply to it, just because I might not be feeling great about myself and where I am. So I think that there's sort of this bias where we have to assume that the people who are more likely to respond are those who are doing very well. There's some sort of I don't know what that term would be, statistically, but some sort of a bias where I'm doing well, so I want to trumpet that and let everyone know. So I do think that number has always been a bit odd. I appreciate the usage of purchasing power parity, though, because I do think that it is possible to have a very nice life in many other countries in the world, a very nice standard of living, even if on a dollar level you're not earning as much. So I do appreciate that aspect of it. But something we were chatting about before we started recording, which is something that I think Conrad pointed out, and I think Caroline and I have also spoken about this before in the past, not just with this ranking, well, mostly with this ranking, but with other rankings, is this idea of there's so much importance placed on this salary percentage increase. And I don't think that should really be a huge part of it because, when I work with candidates who are getting into Harvard and Stanford and Wharton, it is not uncommon for some of these 26-year-olds to be making $200,000, $300,000 a year if they're working in private equity or working for hedge funds. And so as a percentage, yeah, maybe they're not going to be making a huge percentage, increase in that, 1 to 3 years after graduation. But that's because coming in, the data set was already so high. So for me, that's always been something that's bothered me a little bit. And I think, Conrad, I believe that this might be a question or a concern that you've had in the past as well.
Having worked on the other side in a business school itself, the salary and the percentage increase, students, they do zero in on that. And I think one of the challenges when you have this purchasing power parity is explaining to people who are going on to some great careers back in their home countries, but they'll never earn that US dollar amount. But that's what they see, right? So I think that's one of the challenges. And when I was in Cambridge, we had to really explain that to students, to candidates, right? That, as you mentioned, once you go back, they can be living a very good life, but they may not be earning that headline sort of US dollar salary.
Right. Now, I wonder if Conrad, you noticed that a good ranking in the FT has an impact on application volume, and a bad ranking also has a negative impact on application volume, or because you were at Cambridge, which is generally considered, one of the 5 best universities in the entire world, you might have been insulated a bit more from the impact of one single ranking than many other schools.
Well, this was interesting because one of the things that we saw was that actually our application volume didn't really fluctuate with rankings, whether it went up or went down. And I think, was it some GMAC data also shows that people sometimes are sending out more applications as well, right?
Yes.
And so that could be one where the application volume for most schools are going to be determined by other factors, whether that's visa, whether that's job prospects, etc., rather than the ranking. It may well be, though, that the yield, right, the percentage of offers that get converted might have an impact from a school's ranking.
Right. Yep.
Mm.
I think schools that are lower down, that don't have an elite reputation, are far more likely to experience some sort of impact than schools that are widely recognized as excellent in the elite to begin with. And a movement of a few points here or there doesn't make much of a difference at all. I should just mention, in fact, the top 10 um, before we continue our discussion. MIT, as I noted before, is now number one, first time ever. It's up from sixth place last year, so that's a movement of +5. NCEOT is number two. They were number four last year, so they moved up two. Um, Wharton, which had been number one, moved down to three, so they lost two spots. Then two schools were tied for fourth, IESE Business School in Barcelona and London Business School in the UK. In sixth place was HSA Paris. In seven, ESADE Business School. Number eight, SEABS in Shanghai. Number nine, UC Berkeley Haas. And number 10, Harvard Business School. Now, who's missing? Columbia last year was ranked second best. They're nowhere to be found. Bocconi was ranked fourth, nowhere to be found. As I mentioned before, Stanford was missing last year because it failed to hit that response rate threshold. And they're not on the list, probably because of that. Although that hasn't been confirmed, it's possible that Stanford said, you know what, I'm going to pick up my ball and leave the park and go play somewhere else because I'm tired of this craziness. One other interesting thing that I noticed this year is that the majority of business schools in the FT's top 10 for the very first time are all outside the US. That includes five European schools and the one Asian school. If you looked at this ranking 10 years ago, there were only three European schools that made the top 10 and none from Asia. The three were INSEAD, London Business School, and Conrad's old employer, Judge Business School. Now, Conrad, one of the things that intrigues me is your analysis of financial data released by the FT over the years. And you took a real good close look at that data and came to some really interesting conclusions, which is that if you go to a super elite school that's highly ranked, your percentage increase from your pre-MBA pay is going to be much less than if you go to a sort of a school that's not ranked as highly. Is that right?
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. It's just to say that, if you're in the top tier, you'll still get a big salary bump, right? But
Yeah.
moving from the number 10 school to the number 8 school, it's not really going to make huge amount of difference in terms of that kind of salary bump compared to if you go further down, if you're looking at, moving, in the 20s or, somewhere a difference between a school in the 30s and the 20s, that's a big kind of a jump, for example. But I think it goes back to Maria's point that actually, if you look at the rankings as a whole, most people are going to get a good return on their investment. And I think that's something which um, is lost in this current narrative, discussion, and discourse about the MBA and about education in general, right? Where people are questioning is it worth it to go on to higher education? And I think that's one of the great things I think about the FT, right? Is to say, actually, it does make sense. An MBA in 2026 still makes sense if you can go to any of these 100 schools, right? And I think, John, you write some about this regularly, right? And
Yes.
I'm glad you do that because I think it is a story that needs to be told.
And the ROI is definitely there. And what's interesting is often it's measured on a short-term basis. So even the 3-year number for alumni that you see in the FT rankings is pretty short term. I mean, one has to look at the value of this degree and the network you gain from it, as well as the elite employment in many cases over the long term. Because over the long term, the rewards are far more significant. And sometimes, you make this ROI calculation on the short-term basis, and it's really not reflective of what the real value of the degree is and can be. And that's a problem that I think many applicants have. They pull those employment reports and they figure, okay, I'm making this, and now I'm going to make that if I go there. But actually, you're going to make a lot more, and you're going to have more interesting work, probably more meaningful work. You're going to be more professionally fulfilled. You will learn more. You're going to be working with really highly talented and skilled individuals. And it's like playing tennis. Do you play against a player who you beat every day, or do you play against someone who's as good or better than you to make you better? And I think that that's a lot of the equation that goes on that can't be measured tangibly in a ranking, along with a lot of other things that, let's face it, can't be measured, including the actual quality of the education. So while, rankings measure what can be measured, what can't be measured probably is more important. What do you really learn in an MBA program? How does it allow you to professionally grow? And what is that impact long term? You're not going to get that out of a ranking. You're going to get, in some cases you have admission statistics. In some cases you have, well, in all cases you have compensation and employment data. And then in the FT's case, they throw in everything in the kitchen sink. I think there are 21 different metrics that are measured, and some of them have nothing to do with equality. They may be politically correct measures like, we would like to see schools be close to gender parity. And if a school has more women in it and is closer to gender parity, it does better on the FT ranking than if it doesn't. And we all want more women enrolled, but is that really a measure of the program's quality? And then that goes to the advisory board, it goes to the faculty, the number of PhDs that are on the faculty. I have nothing against PhDs, and of course it's an important element because research is so crucial to a quality business school. But I would argue that teaching is just as crucial, if not more so, and oftentimes research and teaching can be in conflict with each other only because of the reward system for promotion and tenure at most business schools. Maria, looking over this year's list, I know that one of the things we've always said in the past is the real value of the rankings is the transparent data in a ranking, because that, you can parse the data for what's kind of important to you. I can't imagine that, how much carbon a school releases is important to that many people, or more important than the quality of the education or the outcomes that you're going to get from it. But I guess if that was important to you, you can probably isolate, the schools that are more sustainable than others on the basis of the FT ranking because of that metric, right?
I will refrain from making a comment about the amount of hot air that your professors in a business school might have, how does that contribute to the ESG ranking. No, I think you're right. I think first of all, more data is always better than less data. We can quibble as to whether or not the data points are relevant, but it's better to have more information versus not, because you can always slice and dice it and reorder the table depending upon which metrics are most important to you. I think it's important, I think that these rankings are important in terms of not only providing large amounts of data. I think it's also interesting in that, first of all, I also like it when they uncover or they unveil new names that might not always be top of mind for people. So, you might start talking to people and they immediately go to like, okay, here's like the top 5 schools, and those are the only 5 schools I want to consider. And then you can point to a ranking like this and you can say, well, actually, look at all of these schools that can provide so much value to you. Maybe you should open your aperture a little, right? Instead of just being so narrowly focused, why don't you widen what you're looking for? Because look at how many of these schools can give you what you are looking for. And I think on that same line, a lot of these changes, when you really dig into the data and you sort the table all these different ways, you also see that some of these differences are really marginal. Right. So, yeah, one school might be ranked first versus fifth, but then when you dig into, okay, whatever, like the salary percentage increase, you're talking 103 percentage points versus 105 percentage points, between, say, Wharton and Harvard. So I think it also helps, hopefully, if somebody looks at these with a sort of sober, rational mind, they'll say, well, wait a minute, the differences between the school ranked first versus 10th, it's not dramatic. on some of these measures, it's barely a noticeable, perhaps even statistically insignificant in some cases. And so I also hope that that helps alleviate some pressure that sometimes applicants feel when they do feel like I have to optimize for the highest ranking. Really, and we've talked about this a lot in the past, when Caroline is here as well, that it shouldn't almost be a numeric, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ordinal ranking. It should almost just be like buckets. So like, here's the top bucket of schools. And as long as you get into one of these schools, you're going to have fairly similar outcomes and fairly similar experiences. Because really, again, when you start looking at some of these, the aims achieved difference, I'm looking at some of them right now. A ton of them have 89%, 89%, 89%, 91%, 83%. So,
There's no
maybe
statistically meaningful difference is the truth.
right.
Yeah. And that's true for most rankings. When you look at the underlying index numbers that are used to generate a school's numerical ranking, what you do find is that the differences are so slight that really statistically there's no difference between a school that could be ranked first and fifth or fourth and 10th. To look for really meaningful differences, you have to get way down into the list versus way up on the list. And then you see the obvious differences, but it's a reflection to me of also what can't be measured. I've always said, to me, the best ranking is yield in a way. You accept a student, and then the student decides whether or not to come. And that tells you a lot about the school in and of itself, because that's the market speaking, and no ranking takes account of yield. Another really important metric, I believe, is the endowment per student. A school that has a lot of money, a lot of resources to hire the best faculty, to hire great staff, to have terrific infrastructure, and work on the alumni network in ways that other schools don't. That's sort of a reflection of the endowment per student. And no one measures that as well. And I would take yield and endowment per student as really far more important metrics than most of what is in fact measured. Now, one of the interesting things that Conrad does, and he's doing this on his LinkedIn feed and in his Substack channel that he has, um, is Conrad loves numbers and he loves analysis. I mean, I consider myself a little bit of a geek when it comes to numbers, but man, Conrad has it all over me. So one of the things that he did just recently before the new FT ranking is he looked at 3 years of data, 2021 to 2024, and he looked at it for a little over a dozen schools in the FT rankings. And then he tried out logistic regression, Monte Carlo simulations, and foldwise isotonic calibration. Now, don't ask me to define what any of those things are, but Conrad, what did you find?
It's a couple of things, right? So first of all, the kind of underlying salary, right? What I was trying to do was, we mentioned before, the weighted salary is an average of 3 years. So I was trying to find out actually estimate what was the underlying salary, which doesn't get reported. And what you do see is that there's actually a big change from year to year sometimes, right? Which
Yeah.
the FT, using its averaging, smoothens out. And I feel that in a way the FT is fine to smoothen it out, but it'd be good if they actually reported the actual salary that the alumni for that year report, the average for that salary. They don't have to use it in the ranking, but just report it, right? Because when they do this averaging, sometimes some schools actually get a lower reported salary than their alumni actually reported because of this smoothing. And conversely, some people get a lower one. So I think it'd be great for candidates and for schools if they knew what their alumni was reporting. So I was trying to do that, but it really uncovered a huge amount of variation from year to year, right? And I think the other part of it was you try to predict, where a school might land in that top tier from year to year using that historical data. By and large, you can be quite accurate, but you just can't predict it when something like Columbia drops out, right? Or Bocconi, it drops out.
Exactly.
And maybe next year they'll come back out of the blue. So I think that's the big sort of surprise X factor that you see in the rankings every year, that you'll have some big heavyweights dropping out, some of them come back, and there's no way to sort of predict what's going on there.
Right. Now, in your prediction model, what you did is you looked at the FT's tier one business schools. And I should point out that every year, if you look at the fine print under the rankings table, the FT will tell you that there are various tiers, which the FT is essentially acknowledging that these schools are so bunched up, you really can't tell much of a difference between or among them. And then the second tier, you can tell a difference between the first and second tier, and so on. And so you looked at the tier one candidates and you labeled, I guess, three schools at risk of falling out of tier one, right? HSA Paris, Duke, and Northwestern Kellogg. And the schools with solid chances, Bocconi and Columbia, were certainly there. And of course, they're not on the list at all, as you just pointed out, because of some odd technical reason involving a survey. Solid chances were given to Cornell, Harvard, NCOD, ISE, London, MIT, Sloan, and Wharton. All of them pretty much made it. With one surprise, Siebes popping into the top 10 and therefore becoming a tier one candidate. What was it about Kellogg and HSA Paris and Duke that where your calculations predicted that they were somewhat at risk of falling out of tier one?
Well, I think it's looking at where they performed over the last 3 years before that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So, like Kellogg 2 years ago was 6, then they got to 10, and you got to wonder whether that's a continued trend.
Yes.
And obviously this year they're at 11, so maybe they've just sort of stabilized and they may be able to rebound for next year.
Yeah. And usually, if you see more volatility in a ranking year to year, you can imagine that volatility suggests that it could continue and the school could fall out of the top tier. And when you see more stability over a period of time, you can pretty much rest assured that the school will continue to perform in and around where it has in the past. And while there are a lot of schools in the FT ranking that have double-digit changes up and down every year, I mean, typically it could be 20 to 25% of the entire top 100 that has a double-digit change. Those schools are just, on a roller coaster ride. I mean, what you often find is schools that fall by the greatest amount one year come back the next year. And you wonder, is it just a statistical anomaly? A quirky thing that happened with the stats and the metrics that allowed for a deep fall or a big increase as opposed to any meaningful change. Because, Conrad will tell you and Maria will tell you that year to year, these programs don't change all that much. And the people who enter them in terms of the quality of the class don't change all that much. So there's not much change going on from year to year. Now, you could argue over a 3-year period, particularly the last 3 years, if they were measuring, for example, the amount of AI instruction in the curriculum or how employers felt about how well prepared the graduates were that they hired in using AI smartly in their companies, that would tell you something. But that's not in any ranking really. And we know that in the last 3 years, schools have made very major changes to curriculum as a result of this disruptive technology being AI. Uh, Maria, based on this ranking, would you change your mind? In other words, we know that Maria went to Harvard. If this ranking came out and now Harvard's number 10, would it change your mind and say, I'm not going there, I'm going to go to MIT instead? Or would you go to one of the European schools?
I would still go to Harvard, but if Harvard would like to send me some sort of a refund check for the tuition that I paid, I would be happy. No, look, this is also where we get to fit. And John, you touched upon this a little bit earlier that it's not even just about the numbers, right? When you go to business school, not simply to maximize whether you're going to make $5 extra versus the next business school, what's that yearly salary 2 years out or whatever that metric is. There are so many qualitative elements that go into your business school experience, both while you're there and in the years that follow. I've mentioned several times that even in Los Angeles, which is not a huge destination for HBS grads, there is a sizable little group of us, and we meet all the time, and we hang out quite a bit, and so I just. There's something that you can't really put that in a ranking. They're not going to put in the ranking like how many friends did you make? But this is where also fit comes into play, right? Like I have spoken in other venues about how the HBS pedagogy specifically, I considered myself to be pretty well suited to it, whereas I would not have been well suited to a school that is perhaps more analytical, heavy, problem set heavy. The last time I had to think about a Monte Carlo simulation was in undergrad, and I have avoided them on purpose ever since. So, but that's not to say, I mean, that for some people, that analytical foundation that they get in business school is what allows them to propel themselves in whatever their future career is. So there's no right or wrong. It's just different. What are you looking for, and different styles and different pedagogies and different emphases in the classrooms. And so I don't know, you just have to sort of think of like, what is it that I want out of this experience, and also realize that there are a number of schools that can give that to you. And yeah, if the ranking, I don't know, if you're going to let a 1 or 2 year fluctuation in a ranking really sway you, then maybe you weren't as committed to this process as you should have been, right? I think you should take it with a rational frame of mind.
Right. And one big grain of salt. Conrad, what's your advice to applicants who look at these lists and then try to discern what patterns they can see and where they should apply? Should they even do that, or is it basically, okay, this what it does give you is a sense of the landscape and a sense of the options that you have, but maybe you shouldn't be treating this all that seriously. What's your advice?
I think it's look at the rankings, the criteria that means something to you, right?
Right.
That's important to you. But also there's lots of other data points. Some of it could be numerical, like the employment reports that schools have. And but also just speaking to the admissions teams, speaking to people like Maria who know from a range of schools, and understanding actually what is that cultural fit? What is that place where you can really flourish and shine? And I think that's the part where you've got to make that individual decision, right? Maybe with the help of probably with the help of people like Maria, right? But also speaking to the schools, just getting, I call it the smell of the place.
Yeah.
And if you love the smell of the place, you think that's right for you, just go for it, because ultimately all these schools, they're all in the different ways give top quality education. They're going to give you good outcomes. It's about what is right for you. And I hope, one of the things that the FT could look at, I mentioned before, they keep changing, chopping and changing, but I really hope they can talk a lot more or measure a lot more the kind of student satisfaction with the pedagogy or the learning environment,
Right.
which Maria put it out really very succinctly, that it's about how you, how in that classroom, whether it was with fellow classmates, with faculty, you really flourished. And that doesn't quite come through in the FT rankings. And I hope they find a way to put that in, instead of what I think they will do is the percentage of your teaching hours that are devoted to AI,
Right. And that's just a number you grab out of the air, because just as there is, I think, with the ESG metric, you grab it out of the air. I don't think it's all that reliable. I don't think you can approach that metric with a whole lot of confidence if you're a user of these rankings. Well, Conrad, thank you for joining us. Really appreciated it. And Maria, as always, thank you for your insights. So we've been listening to Conrad Chua, who had been the executive director of the Cambridge MBA until September of last year. Incidentally, he is now doing some work at LSE. And check out his LinkedIn feed. He has some fascinating insights on higher education in general, and especially business education. And he's a guy who loves data, and I love data. So you'll enjoy reading him. He also, as I mentioned, has a Substack channel, so check that out as well. And if you want our analysis of the new Financial Times ranking, come to Poets and Quants. As usual, we will analyze this up and down and more thoroughly than the FT itself will. And we'll also have a piece on the 10 biggest surprises of this year's ranking from the Financial Times. This is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. Thanks for listening.